Hi everyone, welcome to Chords Records. My name's Katie. As you saw in the thumbnail, I'm going to do a little bit of a look at the recordings, some of the recordings I have of Thelonious Monk, the extraordinary bebop jazz pianist. Now, I'm going to just a little bit of a caveat here. I am not a huge jazz scholar, and I know so many vinyl collectors are. So I apologize in advance if this frustrates you or my lack of knowledge frustrates you. But I tell you one thing, it doesn't matter whether you're a vinyl collector because you just love the music, or you're a vinyl collector because you're a completist of a certain thing, or if you just love jazz or you just love folk. Music is so beautiful, and it's why I collect vinyl. And I have quite a few jazz records. I've been collecting jazz records since I was in my teens, and I'm in my late 50s now. So I love jazz. But I have never done, and in fact, what got me into the vinyl community were a couple of jazz vinyl community specialists. And I just love listening about jazz and just the culture around jazz, the East Coast, West Coast, in the US. What I've never done is gone deep into the chronological kind of history of jazz. I've never kind of opened a book and read an entire kind of biography of a jazz musician. But, when I was in the 80s, I used to collect these beautiful photographic books from a San Francisco publisher called 12 Trees Press, which is now Twin Palms publisher. And I've got a lot of first editions, but one of the first edition I ever got, and this is when I was living in New Zealand, I ended up becoming almost like a distributor friend of a bookshop that distributed all these books. And we traveled around New Zealand selling these books. And one of the first editions I ever got was a book called Jazz by William Claxton. William Claxton, of course, was an amazing photographer who spent a lot of time around the jazz community and subsequently had a lot of jazz covers. And this book, this is my first edition, just has all these beautiful images of the greats, including Thelonious Monk, which I might insert an image of here and you might recognize. So I do love jazz, but this video made me pause. I thought, how much do I know about Thelonious Monk? And so I did a little bit of a kind of a shallow dive on him. I spent the time to watch the amazing documentary that came out in the 80s called Straight No Chaser. If you haven't seen it, it's available on YouTube. It's got Italian subtitles, but just search that Thelonious Monk Straight No Chaser documentary. So it's not the album. And it is an hour and a half of absolute nuggets of footage of Thelonious Monk and his extraordinary jazz chops and his extraordinary personality. So I watched that, and I looked at a lot of my Thelonious Monk kind of recordings that I have access to, and thought, I want to create a video about this and kind of share it, mainly not for the jazz aficionados, but for people who are getting into jazz. I've been asked a few times in the comments on some of my videos, what would be some great jazz albums to start a collection? Now, it's easy enough to Google that. So many of you have done some great videos around that. But Thelonious Monk has to be in amongst it, right? And so I think understanding where he sits in the canon of jazz might be a helpful start for some people. So this video is for you, but also for people who just love Thelonious Monk and jazz. And I'll share some of my albums and also some albums of where he played on of other leaders, jazz leaders. So let's kick off. So Thelonious Monk, he was born in 1917, and he lived most of his entire life in New York. He died aged 64 in the early 80s, and he was a very interesting personality-wise character. He clearly had an alternative way of thinking. In those days, people were calling it a mental illness, and it was treated in various ways. He was institutionalized on and off over the years. I think if he had been born in modern era, this is just my take, he very well could have been approached differently and been given the right support to live his life in a far healthier way. But in the 40s and 50s and 60s, when he was in his prolific best, I don't think he was given the treatment he potentially could have had. So that being said, an absolute genius piano player. So born in 1917 and was writing music, in the 30s, sort of even as a teenager. There are rumours that he wrote his famous song Round Midnight when he was only 19 years old. But let's move forward. He then, in the kind of 40s, he found himself playing at a New York jazz club called Minton's Playhouse. I think that's what it was called. And there, along with Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Bird, they developed what became known as bebop. So you will have heard that expression, bebop, as a genre of jazz. And it's very kind of frenetic, swinging, fast-moving, interesting chordal progressions jazz. It's an acquired taste, but you can't deny its evocative feeling when you listen to it. You're tapping your foot. So Thelonious Monk came out of that kind of Harlem stride tradition. So he very much stride piano, and that slowly developed into bebop. So when he was at Minton's Playhouse, he was developing this style. He was making a lot of friends who were all amazing, who turned into amazing jazz legends. And then in the late 40s, I'm going to look at some notes just so I get some of these dates right. Between 1947 and 1952, he, through a couple of connections, he started recording with Blue Note. And those recordings, that 5-year period, you can actually find on the Blue Note kind of collection of Thelonious Monk. So there is this kind of period where he was recording with Blue Note. So during that time, he did record the genius of modern music. And if you look up lists of great Thelonious Monk albums, usually the Genius of Modern Music Volume 1 or 2, or them together, are in there somewhere. They're in the mix of his greatest releases. And of course, that included Round Midnight. And Round Midnight was this extraordinary composition which he wrote, and there were lyrics put to it, and subsequently became a jazz standard, recorded hundreds, if not thousands of times by many people, probably most famously by Miles Davis. So let's start there. So he's come through that 5-year period of recording with Blue Note. During that time, he's a friend of Charlie Parker, and he does a session. I'm going to start in 1950 with the recordings that I have on vinyl. In 1950, he did a session with Charlie Parker, and this is the first vinyl I want to show you. And I have it on this fantastic 1970s Verve compilation called The Verve Years 1918 to 1950, Charlie Parker. This is a great series. They put them out in the mid 70s to early 80s. They're all these kind of beautiful kind of illustration painted covers. They're always gatefold. There are quite a few Charlie Parker ones. I have about 5 or 6 different artists now. I'm starting to collect them. And they're every single one of them are beautiful condition. I don't think they were played much. And on this particular one, side D features that entire session which features Thelonious Monk. So let me just read you who was on that. So side 4, we have the songs are Mohawk, My Melancholy Baby, Leapfrog, Leapfrog, Relaxing with Lee, Blue Meadow, and Oscar for Treadmill. So this session was recorded June 6, 1950. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Curly Russell, and Buddy Rich on drums. So fantastic, 1950. That's my first Thelonious Monk recording. Okay, so then we move to the early 50s to mid 50s. Thelonious Monk signed with Prestige. So he's been recording with Blue Note, and now he's moving to Prestige. He gets signed to Prestige for 3 or 4 years, from 1952 to 1954. And during that time, he recorded with Miles Davis, who was also on Prestige. And this is my next vinyl. I have this Miles Davis Greatest Hits. And the reason I'm showing this album, this is my original mono on Prestige. This mainly came out in stereo, but this is my original mono. The reason I'm showing this is because this features a classic Miles Davis track called Bag's Groove, of course from the album of the same name, which I don't have. But I love the fact I've got this kind of, we're talking early 50s greatest hits of Miles Davis already. The songs are Solar, Walkin', Conception, When the Lights Are Low, Bag's Groove, and If I Were a Bell. Now, Bag's Groove is probably my favorite track in this entire compilation. I absolutely love it. 11 minutes of absolute brilliance. The players on here for Bag's Groove are Milt Jackson on vibes, Thelonious Monk on piano, Percy Heath on bass, and Kenny Clarke on drums, and of course Miles Davis. So that's my next one. So that one was recorded in 1954. Most of these recordings, despite what vinyl release I show, I'll tell you when the recording was made, just from a chronological point of view. So then in mid-50s, he signs with Riverside. And he was with Riverside for 5 or 6 years. He signed in 1955 and through to 1961. And while he was at Riverside, he released the stunning Brilliant Corners. You can see this is my craft small batch release from a year or two ago. Look at that beautiful cover. This album is one of his greatest albums. So it was released in 1957. He'd signed with, this was his first release on Riverside. And the thing I love about this album, and let me tell you who plays on it. So we have, so you can see there, Sonny Rollins, Ernie Henry, and Clark Terry, which I'll come to in a minute. It's a little interesting story about that. But Thelonious Monk was, as I said in the top of this video, let's call him a character, and probably a complicated person to play with and to record with. Apart from the fact he was a genius, and his compositions were extraordinarily difficult at times. And the interesting thing about this album is the first track, the title track, Brilliant Corners, was so difficult to play for the band members that they never got it right, to Thelonious Monk's liking. And they ended up having to splice various takes to create the one track. And that's the track you hear on this. It's a kind of a modeled together recording. The rest are all done in one take, but this first track, Brilliant Corners, was too difficult for them to get in one go, which I think is just fascinating. So that was on Riverside. Ernie Henry, who is this, you can see there, let me see if there's an image of him. I don't think there is in here. Just as an aside, I have this fantastic album, Ernie Henry Last Chorus. Ernie Henry didn't live long. Ernie Henry had, unfortunately, I think he might have died of a drug overdose, maybe. He died very young, age 31. And they released this not long after. And it's kind of like a compilation best of, album. Ernie Henry, amazing player. He played the alto sax. Let me tell you there's all sorts of people on here. But the track on here, which they feature as an excerpt, was where I first discovered the track on Brilliant Corners. It's actually pre-Brilliant Corners. And they include the excerpt of Thelonious Monk doing a solo, and then Ernie Henry doing his solo from Baloo Bolivar Balooza. And that was a phonetic title of how he said blues, Bolivar blues, how Thelonious Monk said it, the blues, Bolivar blues. And it was actually phonetically, you can see there, phonetically written. That track features on Brilliant Corners. And Ernie Henry's solo in it is just stunning. It's the track 2 on Brilliant Corners. So I just wanted to mention and give a shout out to the great tenor sax player, Ernie Henry. Right, so now we move to 1958, still with Riverside, and he plays on this incredible album, Clark Terry, In Orbit, recently reissued on craft from the OJC Classic series, in turn from the 1958 release of Clark Terry, In Orbit, with Thelonious Monk. Clark Terry was a dear friend of Thelonious Monk, and they decided to record together during a session, and it included a track written by Thelonious Monk. So while Thelonious Monk was at Riverside, he was one of their great talent scouts, and it actually tells you the little story on here, that he would bring in all these different, introduce to Riverside all these amazing jazz musicians, which was why he was happy to support on this album. This is such a great, amazing reissue. I'm so pleased that Kraft are doing the OJC reissues from the 80s. I haven't got many of them. It's one, records are getting very expensive, but the exchange rate in Australia, just FYI, is out of control. So for me to actually just order a stock standard album from the US ends up costing more than $100. So it can get very, very expensive with the exchange rate. But this one I was really interested in getting. I'm so pleased I did. So this one originally came out, as I said, in 1958, still on Riverside. Right. He stays with Riverside until 1951, and then until 1961, and then in 1962 he signs with Columbia. So he started recording with Blue Note, he moved to Prestige for a couple of years, then moved to Riverside, and now he's with Columbia. And each time he leaves these record labels, it's usually because he's become disillusioned with the label. The labels have become disillusioned with him. there's situations going on, and so he's moving around, and so he lands at Columbia in 1962, and in November of the same year he records Monk's Dream, which becomes his probably, I'm pretty sure this is right, it becomes his most famous album ever released in his lifetime. I am lucky enough to have the original Australian copy of Monk's Dream. Plays beautifully, so it's a pretty good copy. This is the cover. So this is my original Australian, which I actually received from my sister, who was parting with her collection. And here is the label, the orange CBS label. You can see how good quality the album's in. Monk's Dream, it is such a beautiful album, and let me tell you who was on this. So it's the quartet, and he brings together Charles Rouse, I think that's how you say his name, correct me if I'm wrong, Charles Rouse on tenor sax, John Orr on bass, and Frankie Dunlop on drums. Charles Rouse has been playing with Thelonious Monk up until this point for quite a few years. In fact, I think they first met in the 40s at the jazz club. And he went on to play with him on and off for many, many years, almost up until his when he ceased playing music publicly. So he's probably the longest continual person that played with him. And he features in the documentary that I mentioned in several interviews. So it's a really interesting insight. And this album has Monk's Dream on it, which is such an incredible song. Body and Soul, Bright Mississippi, Five Spot Blues, Bolivar Blues. Am I saying that correctly? Correct me if I'm wrong. Just a Gigolo, Bayard, Sweet and Lovely. So this was a quintessentially Thelonious Monk at his best, I think. It was such an incredible kind of statement. This look is sort of how we know of Thelonious Monk, with this kind of hat, these little tiny round glasses a la John Lennon later on in life, these just little round glasses. And there's a beautiful moment in that documentary where he first wears them and one of his bandmates is like going, hey, how funny. But he really developed this particular look. Right. So while at Columbia, he then releases one of his many officially released live albums. He'd released live albums while he was at Prestige and Riverside. And then at Columbia, he released 2 or 3, I think, one of which was this album, Miles and Monk, at Newport. 2 totally different sessions. Side 1's Miles Davis, side 2 is Thelonious Monk. Totally different years, in fact, but they collaborated, and Columbia released this official live album. This is one of my favorite albums I've ever picked up, kind of quite cheaply. I picked it up for about $5. I was thrilled to get it. Beautiful, a beautiful copy. Of mine there with the round Columbia red and yellow logo. So this is swinging Thelonious Monk live. It's such a great album. The musicians on it are, let me have a look. We have Pee Wee Russell, Charles Rouse again, Butch Warren, and Frankie Dunlop. Brilliant album. So then we go on to that was recorded in 1963. So we're in the Columbia years now. And then we move into 1968 and this recently uncovered concert. This was fascinating when it came out. This is Monk, Palo Alto. So this was during a time where he was, even though he'd had all these successes, he was still having to turn up to small gigs to, earn a $500 to pay off something. So he wasn't a wealthy man. He did have patrons, which I won't even go into, a particular woman who was a dear patron, and you can find out more about her if you Google it or watch the documentary. But this recording in 1968 is absolutely fascinating. So if you don't know the story, in 2020 this was released, the first time ever. It was a long lost recording from 1968. And what happened was a 16-year-old high school student who was head of the school dancers in Palo Alto invited Thelonious Monk and his band, who had been performing at a nearby event, invited them to come to the high school for a paid gig and do a recording in their hall, in this high school hall. The janitor of this high school was a jazz fan. He was also a hobbyist recording person, audio person, and he got out all his gear and he recorded the session. Isn't that amazing? And this long lost recording was found, pretty beautifully recorded. If you're going to, I mean, it's not high fidelity, but for a high school recording by a worker there, by the janitor at the high school, it's pretty fantastic. And they were swinging. It's a really good album. I love this album. It does polarize, I think, jazz fans, but really interesting just for the story. So that was 1968. 1969, he was in Paris and he was performing at a famous, it's a famous performance, the Salle Pleyel performance. And for a long time, it was only available as a audiovisual medium. So it was in a film. It was available and first released on Laserdisc, if you remember those. And then in more recent times, a couple of years ago, Vinyl Me Please released it, Paris 1969, and released that recording. And it's an interesting recording in that it's well laid into his career. So 1969, if you think he stopped playing in the 70s, he's coming to the end of his journey, and he has this, I think he's 18. He has a teenage drummer with him, which blows my mind that kids can be so brilliant. So Thelonious had heard this young guy and said, come on tour with me. And he was playing with him. Absolutely incredible. And this concert, it's great. It probably doesn't have that kind of finesse or that the energy that some of the early recordings have, but I still love this album. And there's a fun story on here, actually, right at the end, side D, track 2, Nutty. He invites, let me have a look. He invites Philly Joe Jones, who's got no front teeth. He's backstage as an old-time drummer of Thelonious Monk, and he'd turned up, and he invites him on stage, and the liner notes talk about it was a masterclass for the young teenage drummer, and you can hear the energy kick in when he starts drumming, and you can hear Thelonious Monk kind of, this is right, and you can hear the energy kind of come back. Fantastic recording of Nutty. So we've moved in to the very final era of his life, and so he then he plays here and there again, and then the final years of his life, the final 6 years of his life, he's very ill, and he and his wife Nellie live in the house of this patron who has been with him from the beginning, this amazing woman of the Rothschilds family, and he eventually passes away in 1982. An honourable mention that I do want to talk about is this album by Steve Lacy, which I have, and I recently picked up actually for about $30, I think. This is an OJC recording of an album that first came out in 1959. And so if you think back to kind of 1959, that was during the Prestige and then the Riverside eras. So Riverside. So by this stage, he'd been recording for well over a decade, and he was well known. And Steve Lacy puts out this album. Steve Lacy plays Thelonious Monk. Now, I'll tell you who's on this: Steve Lacy, soprano sax; Mal Waldron, piano; Beulah Neidlinger, bass; and Elvin Jones, drum. Steve Lacy, he was a soprano sax player, as I said. Reinterpreting Thelonious Monk, piano compositions, into sax must have been so difficult. And this is actually a great album. And what I love about this album is Mal Waldron's piano playing. So it's a full cover album, and I just wanted to give it an honourable mention. It's not that well known, to jazz people it would be, but it's not one of the heavy hitters of jazz albums. But I love this album. So I hope you've enjoyed my sort of shallow dive into the chronological history of Thelonious Monk and his music. I really just wanted to feature some of the music that I have of him. What I am missing is that original, the genius of modern music. I feel like that's definitely a key one that I don't have. And then there are obviously other albums throughout, but I have kind of got the breadth of his music, which I really loved doing this video and finding out that, I've kind of dipped into the whole kind of the era of him. He influenced so many people. And of course, Miles Davis coming out of bebop. It was just such a fantastic time in jazz. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Could you give me a thumbs up? And if you are watching my videos, please subscribe. It really helps my channel. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.